welcome to the conference on the CCP's forced organ harvesting, hosted by the 117 organizations and co-hosted with the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, ETAC, and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. We're very glad that you're here with us on this very important topic. We hope that you will continue to advance human rights and human dignity to all. I'm Lynn Nguyen, and I will be the moderator. We are using the webinar platform, so hopefully there will be no technical difficulties. If the conference is inadvertently dropped out, please re-enter into the conference room. We will be here. In the next 90 minutes, we will have an open remark from the organizers and recognitions of individuals in the audience. The conference will begin with our keynote speaker, the Honorable Sir Jeffrey Nice, followed by a panel of guest speakers, Professor Wendy Rogers speaking on ethical responsibilities, Ethan Gutmann on forced organ harvesting of Uyghurs in China, Dr. Sean Lin of forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong, Dr. David Mattis on the need for responses, Ms. Christina Olney with the Honorable Congressman from the United States. We will also have remarks from attending dignitaries, including the Honorable Senator Mary Lou McPherson of Canada, Ramesh Sangha, MP of Canada, Samir Zuberi, MP of Canada, Ivan Vilibor Sinic, MEP of Croatia, Herman Terch, MEP of Spain, the Honorable David Kilgore, the Honorable Senator Eric Abetz of Australia, and lastly, Congressman Stubbe of the United States. We will end the conference with a closing remark from Dr. Tran, and following that, at the end of the conference, question and answer session. It will be informal. It will be delayed to be after the conference, and we'd like to invite everyone to the informal discussion. Please feel free to ask questions under chat at any time. We hope to have an abundance of questions for our guest speakers and attending dignitaries. Mr. Chen Anh is the president of the 2000 Foundation. He will deliver the opening remarks on behalf of the 117 organizers. Please welcome Mr. Chen Anh.
Thank you, Mrs. Nguyen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the conference of the CCP forced organ harvesting. My name is End Tran, and on behalf of the Coordinator Committee, which is supported by 117 anti-communist organizations worldwide, I would like to briefly introduce who we are, why, and how we have come to host this special event today. For 45 years, since April 30th, 1975, when the Vietnamese Communist Party controlled our entire country, our Vietnamese diaspora has been fighting for democracy and human rights for Vietnam. As victim and witness of the communist ideology in general, we have learned that Chinese Communist Party is a criminal organization to its own people and a transnational criminal organization to the world. Communism is a poison for humanity, and its system of government is suppressive and destructive. Unfortunately, CCP criminality is not revealed until the victims have survived, escaped, and bravely accused their assailants. Their story has been confirmed and have prompted investigation and calls for intervention by many different NGOs, individuals, and officials. We are fortunate to have many of those in the conference today. In the last 10 months, in our organization have worked together to bring attention to the globalization agenda of the CCP, from the crescent into the South China Sea to genocide of Uyghurs. In the process, we have been inspired by many different democratic government, NGOs, and individuals all over the world, from Australia to Europe, from Canada to England, from USA to Asia. I believe that together our works will make a difference. Today's conference is one outcome to our continuous campaign to bring awareness to criminal activity by CCP. We hope that you will find such an informative pointing to the inevitable conclusion that CCP has been committing a violent crime against its own people and humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Janang, for the meaningful remark. Next, Mr. Phan Thong Hung, President of the Federation of Vietnamese American Communities of the USA, and Ms. Nguyen Thuy of the Vietnamese Environmental Protection Society will recognize attending organizations.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Hung Phang. It's my honor to be here and to recognize attending organizations. First of all, we have Falun Gong Association of Winnipeg, International Society of Human Rights, Sweden, Association of Vietnamese Refugees of Federal Republic of Germany, Lily for Liberty, Louis Drama Center, Work Education Services, Falun Gong China, Hudson Institute, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, Buddhist Youth Organization, Falun Dafa Association of Australia, Old Branch Incorporations, Black Gold School Division, Human Trafficking Foundation, Jewish Movement of Uyghur Freedom, National Civic Council Australia, Happy Science USA, Coalition to Investigate Persecution of Falun Gong, Vietnamese Association Toronto, Author Publicidad, Saw and Light Council, Institute of Korean American Studies, China Aid, International Support of Uyghurs,
Nghe rồi, được chưa?
GLBSMB, SRO, Coordination des Associations des Particuliers pour la Liberté de Conscience, Femmes au cœur de la paix.
Please unmute yourself, Ms. Thuy.
Hello, my name is Nguyen Thuy Nguyen. I would like to continue all the attendance organization from the list of Professor Hung Pham. They are of Free Tibet, BRBL Technical, Yet Again, World Uyghur Congress, Vietnamese American Republican of Georgia, Justice of All Canada, Families of the Missing, China Alarm, the Communication Group, Boston Uyghur Association, 6 St. James Hall Chambers, SCG Advice Prague SRO, Jubilee Campaign, Church of Scientology National Affairs Office, Vietnam Republic, Republic of Vietnam Government and the Exile, Block 8406 Overseas, Who Did Vo MD Inc., Free Vietnam Global Network, Alliance of Independence and Democracy of Vietnam, Falun Dafa Practice Group, Florida Falun Dafa Association. And let's continue with ETAC, Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation, Church of Protestant Lutheran Community of Vietnam, Representative Committee of the Popular Bloc of Cao Dai Church, Sangha of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, Traditional Hoa Hao Buddhist Church, Interfaith Council of Vietnam, Federation of Vietnamese American Communities of the USA, Hội luận Thắng Nghĩa, Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, Viet 2000 Foundation, Vietnamese Canadian Federation, Vietnam Democracy Center, Vietnamese Environmental Protection Society, and Vietnamese Nationalist Party. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Phạm Oanh of Hội luật Thắng Nghĩa will recognize the dignitaries, media community, and universities that are in attendance.
Good afternoon from America. My name is Wan Pham, and it is my great honor to welcome our guests representing governmental offices, academic institutions, and media agencies from many countries to this conference. Please forgive us for missing any organization unintentionally or by request, knowing that you are very welcome and your presence greatly appreciated. Officials with us today are from the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the European Commission, the Liberal Party of Australia, the Senate of Australia, the FBI, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, the Parliament of Sweden, the U.S. Department of State, the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, the Permanent Mission of Republic of Korea at the UN, the Permanent Mission of Mongolia at the UN, the European Conservative and Reformist Party, the European Parliament, the New Zealand Parliament, the New Zealand Government, the New Zealand Labour Party, the Canadian House of Commons, the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, the Senate of the Parliament of Canada. We have members of the media from the BBC, the New Tang Dynasty TV, the Epoch Times, Star and Stripes, Dân Văn Magazine, HQ8 Channel, Amstelveen Park, Netherlands, CNS News, and NTD Canada. We also have faculty members of Baylor College of Medicine, the University of South Alabama, the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, the University of Houston Downtown, the University of Texas, the University Central de Venezuela, the University of Da Nang, Vietnam, the University of Bahama, the University of Cincinnati, the University of Shizuoka, Japan, the University College of Leuven-Limburg, Belgium, the University of Greenwich, UK, St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University, UK. Thank you for joining this important event.
Thank you all for being here with us. We begin with the keynote speaker. Please mute and inactivate your videos. Sir Geoffrey Nice QC has been a barrister since 1971 and served as a judge in England since 1984. Between 1998 and 2006, he led the persecution of Slobodan Milosevic, former president of Serbia, at the UN's International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In 2007, he has advised and represented states, applicants, and victims concerning international armed conflicts at the International Criminal Courts and elsewhere. He chaired the China Tribunal, a people's tribunal into forced organ harvesting. We give you the Honorable Sir Geoffrey.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, is Dr. Triet to speak? No, just me. Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Make sure you let me know if I'm not audible at any stage. There are a lot of people rather more interesting on this panel to hear from than me, and so given the time that's already passed, I'll keep my remarks as short as I can. As chairman of the China Tribunal into forced organ harvesting, and now chairman of the Uyghur Tribunal, it won't surprise you to know that I can actually say nothing personal, express no personal opinion really about anything to do with China and what China is doing at the moment or has done in the past, beyond what is contained in the China Tribunal judgment, which was published in full earlier last year. So I think that what I will do instead, and I hope this will help, is just say a few words about the process of the China Tribunal into forced organ harvesting. And for those of you not familiar with them, it is necessary to know just a little about people's tribunals in general. They have some use, but they're no panaceas. They are of some use when there is a gap, when governments or international organizations have failed to ask and answer a question that needs to be asked and answered. They've usually failed to do that for what are called geopolitical reasons. Often enough means they're frightened of the state concerned about which the question should be asked and answered. The history of these tribunals is, after the Second World War, fairly limited in numbers, at least in the European setting, many more perhaps in South America. But in Europe, the most famous one that started it was Lord Russell's People's Tribunal into the Vietnam War. It was a very flawed tribunal. It only tried one side of the conflict, and the panel members were all of a certain political persuasion, or nearly all of them, and hostile to the United States of America. So their judgment or decisions have perhaps little weight, and that may be the fate of the decisions of many of these tribunals. But Lord Russell whatever the mistakes he made in the formulation of his tribunal, set a path along which others have trod. The most important other tribunal, before we come to the period of the tribunals with which we are immediately concerned, was probably the so-called Comfort Women Tribunal, which reported in 2000 on the sexual enslavement of women for the Japanese military in World War II. And for those of you not familiar with it, it's worth looking up. It's not always easy to find on the internet, but it's worth looking up. This was a major exercise of evidence gathering by non-governmental organizations from the very many countries from which women put into this terrible and sometimes deathly slavery were concerned. I first became involved in people's tribunals, knowing absolutely nothing about them, when I was asked to help out a little bit with the tribunal that dealt with the atrocities in Iran in the late 1980s, when the opposition were slaughtered in various prisons. What was quite interesting from my point of view is I was asked to join, and I joined as a part of the advisory board. And there were a couple of other lawyers on the advisory board, and we gave the advice that lawyers tend to give. And by and large, our advice was rejected. And it was rejected by the organizers, and the organizers were pretty nearly always right. And we were wrong, which I suppose was an indicator to me that lawyers have always got to be a bit careful about venturing into activities outside those with which they are strictly familiar. But what I did notice about the Iran Tribunal was its immensely powerful effect for the people who had established it. The next tribunal I was concerned with was slightly less satisfactory, and I won't dwell on that, but I learned lessons from both of those tribunals. And then, I don't know, 5 years ago, was it? I was asked by a man called Ben Rogers, of whom some of you will know, if I would write an opinion about the legality or the criminality of what may have been happening in the People's Republic of China by way of forced organ harvesting. And I told Ben Rogers that writing an opinion was probably a complete waste of time, because nobody would ever read my opinion, and they'd take no notice of it. I said, nevertheless, I'll do what I could, and had they thought of a People's Tribunal? And they hadn't. And I don't think they really wanted to, because they already had, from 3 of the people present at this conference, opinions in different forms, but following substantial research, leading to, in their judgment, to complete certainty about what was happening. Why on earth would they want to have another body, a People's Tribunal, start all over again and possibly reach a different conclusion? But I dare say, and either Wendy Rogers or maybe or David Metas or someone will be able to tell you, I guess the reason they eventually decided they'd like to have People's Tribunal was because the absolute certainty with which others had expressed views about what happened had nevertheless been turned down, rejected by country after country, always saying something like, well, we're not quite certain that the evidence is enough. And by government saying that, or something similar to that, they could justify doing nothing. And so a tribunal was set up. Susie Hughes of ETAC can tell you more about it. But the principles I applied, which I'd drawn from observation of and experience in a couple of other tribunals, were the following. And they were built on this basic principle. If we, the people, are let down by governments and international organizations not doing what they should by asking and answering questions to which we need answers, then we shouldn't be too keen to imitate them. We shouldn't be like an ordinary court. We shouldn't be like a parliamentary committee. We should be the people. The people. So I wasn't interested particularly in forming a tribunal of lawyers or NGO specialists, and certainly not the people who were particularly knowledgeable about China. I was interested in forming a tribunal, to the extent possible, of people with a wide range of disciplines. And the Uyghur Tribunal, which has now been formed and built on the experience of the China Tribunal, is even more diverse and even less populated by people who might look like the usual people for such a job. A whole range of people in the Uyghur Tribunal and quite a wide range in the China Tribunal. And I wanted the tribunal to be pretty much like a jury. For those of you who know what juries are in either criminal or civil trials, they're a body of citizens who come to answer a question. And they are told right at the beginning of their job, make no assumptions, start with a blank sheet of paper. And that is what we did. Notwithstanding the very powerful conclusions that had already been reached by David Mattas, David Kilgour, and Efrem Gutman, he said, no, we're not interested in their opinions. We will, of course, look at the evidence upon which they've relied to form their opinion, and we'll look at all the other evidence. We'll try and find out what the position of the People's Republic of China was, and having started with a blank sheet of paper and putting on it nothing but evidence, and then saying, of what are we completely sure? What are we certain beyond reasonable doubt? And that led to the conclusions about forced organ harvesting, about crimes against humanity, but not genocide, that you will know of if you've read either the short or the long form of the judgment. And then what did we do? Well, largely, we just walked away. And that, I think, is very important. We were not activists. None of us knew of forced organ harvesting before we started work on this. We were not particularly sympathetic to the victims, if there are any, as we found there were in China. We were just citizens answering a question. Now, you may think that that's denying ourselves the pleasure, maybe, of going further and banging the drum. But no. We judged, and I hope wisely, that having reached the factual and legal conclusions, because we had lawyers telling us what the law was, those of us who had a bit of law within the jury room didn't say what the law was. We waited to hear it from the outside experts. Sure. Having delivered our verdict, like a jury, we said, it's not for us to make recommendations. It's not for us to tell everybody else what they should be doing. That would be overreaching to the greatest possible extent. We observe that educational establishments, businesses, travel companies, all sorts of other institutions that deal with China have to take account of this judgment of ours. But basically, all we did was to provide a judgment for others to use. Will this be as ineffective or apparently non-effective as many of the other people's tribunals has been? Maybe. But so far, one thing seems to be pretty clear. If a collection of citizens with no axes to grind, no background preconceptions, not activists, just deal with evidence that is presented to them. They have the right to call for some additional evidence and check things out, but basically just dealing with the evidence, just reading an answer to a single question, handing that answer over in the form of the judgment. Do you know what? It's very difficult for anyone to challenge that, especially if, as in the case of this judgment, all the reasoning of the ordinary citizen is on display. It's there to see. And in the year and a half, or 2 years, I suppose, since the judgment was first announced, it has not been deconstructed or challenged in detail by anyone. It is a judgment of a number of people working together, my colleagues and me, as equals. It is a judgment of the citizens, and it is there for all the other citizens to use. Because, this is my last observation, when I say all the other citizens, which ones do I mean? I mean all the citizens of the world. Why do I say that? Not particularly in relation to this, but in relation to any finding of gross criminality. After the Second World War, when there was some, at least temporary, maybe temporary, move away from the notion of the sovereign state to some forms of internationalism, globalization, grew and may now be under threat again. When that started, with the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, it was understood that rights were universal. And if rights are universal, duties are universal too. And they're not the duties of just governments, they're the duties of people. And therefore, if a finding is made that fundamentally breaches the rights of one group of people, the rest of us, whatever that breach may be, if it's grave enough, obvious enough, and made clear to us, that breach engages in us a duty to do something to put it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Jeffrey. We look forward to your continued leadership and future work. Please note that there are 2 PDF files from the China Tribunal that's in the handouts. It's under the handouts tab on your control panel. Please feel free to open and download the PDF files. Next is the panel discussion. Panelists and attending dignitaries, please activate your videos. If you've been invited to enable your videos, please activate them. The organizers would like a lively and interactive panel with everyone's videos on. Thank you for your cooperation. While we wait for the panelists to activate the videos, Ms. Nguyễn Văn Nhã will recognize the coordinating committee of the conference. We especially want to thank our co-hosts, ETAC and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Please welcome Ms. Văn Nhã.
Good afternoon. I am Nhã Nguyễn of Vietnam Democracy Center. I'm honored to be here and would like to introduce the coordinating committee as Pastor Nguyễn Hoàng Hoa, President, Church of Protestant Lutheran Community of Vietnam, Subdignitary Hứa Phi, Chair, Representative Committee of the Popular Bloc of Cao Đài Church, Most Venerable Thích Không Tánh, Vice President, Sangha of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, Lê Văn Sóc, Vice President, Central Leadership Committee, Traditional Hòa Hảo Buddhist Church, Lê Quang Hiển, Secretary General, Interfaith Council of Vietnam, Dr. Đỗ Văn Hội, Overseas Representative, Interfaith Council of Vietnam. Professor Phan Thông Hưng, President, Federation of Vietnamese American Communities of the USA. Tạ Du, Coordinator, Hội luận Thắng Nghĩa. Phạm Văn Oanh, Hội luận Thắng Nghĩa. Nguyễn Linh, JD, Director, Office of International Relations, Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam. Trần Anh, President, Viet 2000 Foundation. Nguyễn Đình Tùng, Viet 2000 Foundation. Trần Văn Đông, Secretary General, Vietnamese Canadian Federation. Dr. Nguyễn Quang Nhất Thiên, President, Vietnam Democracy Center. Dr. Nguyễn Như Phúc, Vice President, Vietnam Democracy Center. Dr. Quốc Hưng Trần, Vice President, Vietnam Democracy Center. Nguyễn Văn Nhã, Treasurer, Vietnam Democracy Center. Dr. Mai Thanh Triết, President, Vietnamese Environmental Protection Society. Ms. Nguyên Thủy, Vietnamese Environmental Protection Society. Lê Thành Nhân, Chairman, Vietnamese Nationalist Party. Phan Thanh Châu, Vice Chair, Vietnamese Nationalist Party. Thank you.
We thank the coordinating committee for their diligence and hard work. We gather here today from over 25 countries, 117 organizations, 40 dignitaries and officials, 12 universities, 7 media organizations, and 10 different time zones. We thank you to our panelists and dignitaries for being here with us. We are eager to hear and learn from your experience and research. Our first speaker is Professor Wendy Rogers, MD, PhD. Dr. Rogers is a professor of clinical ethics at Macquarie University, Sydney. She has a long-standing interest in transplant ethics and has contributed to Australian national ethics guidelines on organ and tissue donation. She is chair of the International Advisory Committee of ETAC. In 2019, her team's work into unethical transplant research in China triggered over 20 retractions. Please welcome Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much for that kind welcome. I'd like to thank the organisers and everyone who's attending today across the different time zones. And I acknowledge that I'm meeting today on the traditional lands of the Camaragal clan and of the Darug people of Indigenous peoples of Australia, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. My talk is about ethics. Forced organ harvesting is a terrible wrong. Innocent people are killed so that their organs can be transplanted into other people who are willing to pay for them. Clearly, the Chinese Communist Party bears ultimate responsibility for forced organ harvesting. It is the CCP which has sanctioned the persecution of victim groups and permitted the development of industrial scale organ transplantation in China. But we cannot let it rest there by saying that the CCP is responsible and they should stop. As Sir Geoffrey has pointed out, the victims of forced organ harvesting are our fellow human beings. Their rights are being breached. They are owed the same basic regard for and protection of their rights as is owed to all human beings. And as fellow humans, we have some responsibility, some duty to respond to their plight. But some lines of responsibility are stronger and more compelling than others. And here I want to focus on institutional and professional responsibilities for acting to stop forced organ harvesting. There are two conditions for holding institutions and professionals responsible in this context. First is a knowledge one. The relevant institutions and professionals must be aware that forced organ harvesting is occurring in China. And the second condition is that these organizations and professionals must have power to act in ways that can help to stop forced organ harvesting. And I argue that both of these conditions are met. First, institutions and professionals should have grave ethical concerns about transplantation in China. There is no longer any excuse for willful ignorance about these transplant-related human rights abuses. Information about these abuses is compelling and detailed, and as Sir Geoffrey has outlined, the China Tribunal performed an independent and exhaustive examination of the evidence and unequivocally found that China is committing crimes against humanity. This finding has been widely publicized. The incarceration of the Uyghurs is likewise well known and has raised public awareness about human rights abuses, particularly in Xinjiang. There's no longer any excuse for any institution or professional involved in transplantation to claim that they know nothing about forced organ harvesting. So the first condition for being held responsible, the knowledge condition, is met. The second condition for responsibility is power. We can hold transplant professionals and institutionals responsible for not acting if they do have power to act in this context. And here we need to be clear about the type of power I have in mind. Do these institutions and professionals have the power to stop forced organ harvesting in China? Not directly. No individual or institution alone can force the CCP to stop. But acting together, professionals and institutions can exert significant pressure on China. They can demonstrate their abhorrence of what China is doing and show that such actions are not tolerated by the rest of the world. So given this responsibility, there are many specific actions that professionals and institutions should take. Transplant professionals should ask or demand that their professional organizations have an effective and enforced transplant policy for China that excludes transplant doctors from China as members, bans transplant doctors from China from attending or presenting at their meetings, and strongly advises their own members not to travel to China for transplant activities of any kind. Otherwise, engaging in educational research and research exchanges with China, business as usual, sends the message that those involved have no ethical concerns. Any normalized professional interaction provides implicit moral support for and endorsement of the Chinese transplant system and should therefore stop. Other actions that transplant professionals should take include informing patients about the links between organ trafficking and buying an organ in a foreign country as an organ tourist, and the nature of these dangers if they travel to China. They should lobby their members of parliament to ratify and implement the Council of Europe Convention against Trafficking in Human Organs, and they should raise public awareness about organ trafficking and the need for transnational solutions, because transplant professionals have high prestige and generally command the ears of people like MPs if they are aware of them. Transplant institutions should set up processes to check all research and education collaborations with China and stop any that involve transplant medicine. And transplant journals should ban publication of all Chinese transplant-related research, exclude transplant doctors from China as members of their editorial boards, and explain the reasons for these actions to their readers. None of these actions alone will stop forced organ harvesting in China, but together they will send a strong message that the rest of the world will not tolerate this atrocity. Those in the transplant world have an ethical responsibility to act. They have the necessary knowledge and the power to speak out and speak up. We should hold them responsible for their silence if they do not. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers, for setting the tone of ethical responsibilities. Our next speaker is Ethan Goodman, who will speak on forced organ harvesting of Uyghurs in China. Ethan Goodman is a China Studies Research Fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C., and co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, His writing on China is widely published, including 3 books: Losing the New China, The Slaughter, and Bloody Harvest / The Slaughter, an update. In 2017, Goodman was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Please welcome Mr. Ethan Goodman.
Thank you. I think I'm going to be not just a presenter today, but a host for a few minutes because I have a PowerPoint. Is that right? So if you can make me a host, then I can show you what's on my screen. Okay. There we go. Show my screen. Very good. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the logistics of. Can you all see that? Do you see this image? Is that right? Yes? Hello?
Looks good.
Nobody?
Yes.
Yes.
Good,
Yes.
good. Okay. Is that distracting? Is that other thing on my screen or are you getting a full screen effect? Because I'm seeing something else as well. Or are you seeing a full screen, full picture? Okay. I'm going to talk about the logistics of Uyghur organ harvesting today, very specifically. So I'm going to begin, though, with 2 familiar images. The first is this video still of Uyghur or possibly Kazakh prisoners being moved by rail. And most of you have seen this. Now, we don't know what happened to these men. Yet starting in 2016, Uyghur and Kazakh refugees have described sporadic mass executions. For example, a bunch of prisoners are being bused to Qinghai province, and when they cross the provincial boundary line, the PSB leads the prisoners out and shoots them all in an open field. We don't know the motive for these killings, but we do know that mass executions are associated with disposal problems. Mass killings overwhelming a crematorium facility within a matter of hours in one case, local crematoriums occasionally acknowledging burning bodies from the camps and so on. So disposal systems can be critical evidence. And I'll give you an example. The only Wuhan COVID death toll estimate with any real reliability comes from counting the sale of funeral urns, for example. Now, Beijing is aware of this vulnerability. And since 2018, Uyghur cemeteries have been routinely bulldozed. Clearly, that's an attack on Muslim cultural traditions, yet it also permanently eliminates family DNA. 3 years ago, Gulchera Hoja of Radio Free Asia discovered the local authorities had put out a directive in 2017, construct 9 new crematoriums across Xinjiang, East Turkestan. Urumqi was first. An ad appeared in the Chinese language press to fill 50 security guard positions. That's at an unheard of salary of $1,200 US per month. And in 2020, a camp refugee in Norway took a virtual tour on Google Earth of a camp he recognized in the Aksu prefecture. Ms. Hoja, using the Wayback Machine, established that the camp was built around an already existing and still functional institution, the Aksu Infection Hospital. That's outlined in red on your screen. Those buildings are still there. The original buildings, they've been moved around a little bit or changed a bit, but it's a working hospital. In fact, all the elements of organ harvesting, a hospital, camps, and a crematorium come together in a single square kilometer. And we can see that here. To the left, the West Camp contains 16,000 people. To the right, the East Camp contains 33,000 people, and the Aksu Infection Hospital. Forming the northern part of the triangle, 900 meters from the camps, for both camps, is a large crematorium. Now, a closer look at that. There are no visible smokestacks, yet David Campanelli of the BBC has pointed out to me that a rotary kiln incinerator is a very low emission system. Yet we also see 2 distinct lines joining the crematorium in the middle of the building. A bit hard to see there, but these could be walls, but they more closely resemble pipes. So the crematorium may be using a water-based system, alkaline hydrolysis. That is, pump fresh water in, mix with potash. Heat the chamber to approximately 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Fats, hair, and bones break down, and the effluent can be drained into a leach field or simply pumped back into the Aksu River, which is 400 meters away. From Aksu Infection Hospital, it's a short drive to Aksu Airport, which has a special lane for human organs, a special fast lane. Although China's Southern Airlines confirms that human organs are transported via the Aksu Green Passage, they don't provide a photo. But here's a Green Passage photo from Kashgar Airport instead. From Aksu Airport, there could be several end users. Here's my prime suspect. It's a hospital in Hangzhou, near Shanghai. The first hospital of Zhejiang province has a formal big brother relationship with Aksu's doctors and medical apparatus. It's one of China's 10 certified ECMO training centers. And in 2017, liver transplants increased by 90% and kidney transplants went up by 200%. On March 1st, 2020, this, by the way, obviously coordinates with the camps are starting to reach a peak in Xinjiang at that point. On March 1st, 2020, First Hospital successfully performed the first double lung transplant on a COVID-19 patient. This was essentially an advertisement for foreign organ tourists that even during the pandemic, First Hospital was open for business. Okay, so to conclude here, we found one of the crematoriums with housing, medical, and transport infrastructure for the live organ harvesting of Uyghurs, and possibly Falun Gong. In fact, we know Falun Gong are often in these camps as well. Several witnesses have reported that to me. There's also Kazakhs, obviously, Kyrgyz, and Hui. Now, we'd like to collect all 9 crematoriums, and that is a big goal of ours, and we're not there yet. But I will say one thing about the scale of this overall. And my investigation in Kazakhstan, which was done just before the lockdown last year, involved extensive interviews with camp refugees. And here's my preliminary conclusion. At a minimum, 25,000 Uyghurs, average age 28 years old, are taken from the camps to be harvested every year. And about 68 people a day, that means, are being harvested for their organs. The higher range of my witness statements doubles that number to 50,000 per year, approximately, about 136 a day. The party's strategy is a troika of forced labor, lowered Uyghur fertility, and organ harvesting. And I've called this combination maintenance genocide. And I've assumed that the party's intentions run something along these lines. We will assimilate Uyghurs if we must, if we can. We will kill them if we must. Yet, you have to ask, what if that's only true under conditions of consistent Western pressure on Beijing? A crematorium that can support 50 security guards can process 136 bodies a day without breaking a sweat. And it is that excess capacity of 9 industrial scale crematoriums that should make us all wonder if the party's true intentions are closer to this statement. We will assimilate Uyghurs if we must. We will kill them if we can. And I'll end there, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ethan, for giving us the information on forced organ harvesting of Uyghurs in China. Next, Dr. Sean Lin will speak about the forced organ harvesting against Falun Gong. Dr. Sean Lin is the Communication Director for Falun Dafa Association in Washington, D.C. He served in the U.S. Army as a Medical Service Corps officer and was the lab director for viral diseases branch in Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. Dr. Lin is a survivor of 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre and was detained in China in 2000 for his activism to end the persecution of Falun Gong. Please welcome Dr. Lin.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, the unmute button suddenly stuck in the middle. And so I would like to first thank you for all the organizers and also all the panelists. It's my great honor to join this panel discussion. And it's also great to hear Sir Jeffrey Lee's inspiring speeches. And so regarding about the forced organ harvesting happened to Falun Gong practitioners, I think yes, definitely very important to recall what the China Tribunal has concluded. So the China Tribunal has made a final judgment that the crimes against humanity has been committed in China, and these including murder, extermination, imprisonments, and other severe deprivation of physical liberties, and also torture, rape, or any other forms of sexual violence. Also, in any involuntary disappearance, right? So Sir Jeffrey Lees also emphasized that it was indeed Falun Gong practitioners who were used as a source, probably the principal source of organs for forced organ harvesting. So I think these historical judgment made by China Tribunal has made it very, very explicit, and it was the result of really thorough year-long investigation. And so I believe that both international transplant medical communities, as well in general, probably the whole international medical community, need to take to heart for this conclusion. And in any occasion, if they have any public engagement with the Chinese Communist regime, they need to talk about this. They need to present these conclusions, these judgments, and demand Chinese government to stop the organ harvesting. So I think once the China Tribunal make this judgment, the situation already changed a lot a bit in terms of how we deal with a Chinese communist regime, because it's not a time again to call for independent investigations. I think right now it's critical is actually for international society to be united to take action, not call for another independent investigation. Because just like recently we saw the WHO leading an investigation go to Wuhan to try to find the origin of the virus, the COVID-19. But you can see when Chinese regimes arrange all these investigations, there's no way the international society can know the truth, can know what exactly happened inside China. And so it's critical that we should adopt the strategy of distrust and verify, just like what Secretary Pompeo, the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, has emphasizing. Dealing with the Chinese communist regime, you need to distrust and verify, and you need to separate the Chinese communist regime from Chinese people. And so under these kind of pretext, I think it's very, very important to see that the Chinese Communist Party not only did not stop the organ harvesting, the forced organ harvesting, they actually still escalated. So even just for the last 2 years, we know the organs continue to be available on demand, and phone calls to hospitals, the transplant centers in 2009 indicate extremely short waiting times for organs. I just need a couple of weeks, you can get a liver transplant. This is unbelievably a very short waiting time. So indicating the Chinese government still running a large living organ donor bank. And the World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong has also conducted thousands of phone call investigations and also searching internet data, web archives to compare many of the reports from Chinese media as well as the transplant center's own webpage, and they already find out that the Chinese government have a large amount of existing living organ donor banks in different parts of China. And so the fundamental situation is that CCP live harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners' organ has not been stopped, even though the China Tribunal was so shocking to the whole world and it was widely published, but the Chinese government still denying it. And also they've been using the WHO to help them cover up. And so the problem is that the international organization like World Health Organization has been collaborating with Chinese communist regime to help them deceive the whole world. Just like WHO formed this task force for organ donation system, and it was actually initiated by the Chinese communist regime. And one of the notorious doctors who was involved in organ harvesting, Dr. Huan Jiefu, he was also actually the initial member for this task force. So basically, CCP now can run these live organ harvestings under the cover of the World Health Organization, and they can keep deceiving the whole world, saying now, since 2015, we have voluntary donation systems, right? Because before 2014, they deceived the world, saying they are using the executed prisoner. But after that lie cannot sustain, they choose another lie. They say we make new voluntary systems nationwide. So they are fabricating data showing them more and more Chinese people register as organ donors, right? So these lies, just one after another, just like the Chinese Communist Party lie about the COVID-19, about the human-to-human transmission, that already present a huge risk to the global community, but the Communist Party doesn't care about the life of Chinese people as well as global community. So when the international society is not facing the challenge, the realities the Chinese communist regime did to the whole world, we actually suffer from these, you can say it's educated negligence. Many of the governments not taking strong enough actions to deal with the problems, and many of the government even avoid confronting the Chinese community on these fundamental crimes against humanity issues, and people not addressing this issue directly with the Chinese communist government as well as the medical societies in China. Because in China, if Chinese Communist Party control all the legal systems, judicial systems, military systems, armed police systems, and the media industries. They can cover up anything they want. And if they don't want the whole world to know the truth, it's very hard for international society to go into China to expose the true situation. And so if the United States and many other international society not united, the Chinese government can always hide and find different excuse and deceive the whole world, and the whole world will suffer more and more from the crimes committed by the Chinese communist regime. So I want to emphasizing that my fundamental message is that the key issue here is how we deal with the Chinese Communist Party. It's not just about the medical ethics issues in China, about the transplant industries, because the Chinese government state-run forced organ harvesting has already turned into a large industry. To many of the transplant centers, it's like a vampire addicted to sucking the blood from people. They already in this kind of status. If you did not deal with the Chinese Communist Party directly, the rampant forced organ harvesting in China won't stop. So definitely, I call for international society to take strong actions to condemn China, to take active actions in legislations to stop organ tourism in China. And I'm really impressed by Dr. Levy from Israeli, and he advocate in the Israeli parliament to stop the insurance company paying the coverage for organ sources from China. And after the legislation was passed and no Israeli people go to China for organ transplant, I think it was very powerful. And the medical community just need common sense. They don't need additional investigation in China. Just based on your common sense, take actions. I think the international society can take actions. Just depends on your will and your common sense. So I hope the more and more people globally can step forward to urge Chinese communist parties to stop the organ harvesting. This is not just regular crimes against humanity. It's a cold genocide. Recently, I think Maria Chong, Thorsten Trey, and also David Matas had a publication describe the organ harvest happened in China as a cold genocide. It takes time. It's not a hot genocide, but it aims to wipe out a group, a specific group based on their religions, and they can take time using any means they wanted. So this is a very dangerous situation, and also it's an urgent issue. So that's why I'm a call for international society to unite together and take action to stop the cold genocide of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. Dr. David Matas, our next speaker, will address the need for responses. Dr. Matas is an international human rights lawyer, currently acts as Senior Honorary Counsel for Benai Birth Canada. He has served in the Government of Canada in numerous positions, including as a member of the Canadian delegation to the United Nations Conference on the International Criminal Court, the Task Force of International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research, the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe Conferences on Anti-Semitism and Intolerance. We're pleased to give the floor to Dr. Matas.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to speak. The topic I'm addressing is the need for legal responses. So the question is, does the law have any role to play in ending forced organ harvesting in China? Well, I would say within China itself, there does not seem to be much point. The Chinese Communist Party, as we've just heard from the previous speaker, runs the Chinese legal system. The party enacts and enforces laws against others, not against itself. The party is not going to use the law to stop itself from doing what it wants to do. The law does have a role to play in avoiding complicity abroad with what happens in China, and there's definitely a need for laws to do that. Right now, for many countries, if a person kills someone in their own country for their organs, the person will have committed a crime. But if the person goes to China for an organ harvested from a prisoner of conscience, the person has committed no crime in their own country, and whatever crime they may have committed in China will not be prosecuted. Local laws prohibiting complicity in forced organ harvesting abroad should be enacted, but they also should be general. Even though the practice of killing prisoners of conscience for their organs is unique to China, laws prohibiting complicity should not be China-specific. Laws prohibiting complicity in killing prisoners of conscience for their organs, which mention only China, would suggest that killing prisoners of conscience for their organs in other countries, even if theoretical, would be perfectly okay. That is not a suggestion any law should be making. But there is a trouble with generic laws. They do not send much of a message to China. The Chinese Communist Party, while financing the health system and the military with the sale of organs sourced from prisoners of conscience, denies vehemently that this is happening. Chinese officials typically do not oppose foreign generic laws prohibiting complicity in forced organ harvesting abroad. They just end up saying that the law does not apply to them, claiming there's no such abuse in China. So generic laws, though important, do not get us very far. More pointed are China-specific laws. These laws serve a dual purpose. They help to avoid complicity, and they also point a finger. The more specific the finger pointing, the better. One obvious tool which should be used, but has not been used to date, is Magnitsky legislation. Under that legislation, which now exists in several countries and is spreading, persons complicit in gross violations of human rights can be publicly named, barred entry to the country, and have their assets in the country frozen. This legislation has been used where it exists for a wide variety of human rights violators in many countries, but it has not been used for those identified as complicit in forced organ harvesting in China. The authorities of various countries which have this legislation have been asked to add perpetrators of forced organ harvesting in China to their Magnitsky Act lists. However, to date, there have been no such additions, and there should be. For all those involved in the transplantation sector in China, in light of the widespread prevalence of forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience in China, there should be a reverse presumption. It should be presumed that everyone involved in the transplantation sector in China is complicit in forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience, absent clear and convincing evidence to the contrary. What this would mean, and this is something we've heard about from Wendy Rogers, is no exchanges between the transplantation components of hospitals in China and hospitals abroad, no visiting professorships to the sector in China or from it, certainly no honorary degrees of persons engaged in the sector in China, no presentation or publication of papers allowed from researchers in the sector in China, no training for work in the sector in China, no attendance at transplant conferences in China or allowed attendance abroad from the sector in China, no memberships in foreign transplant associations, no foreigners joining Chinese transplant associations, and so on, unless the presumption is rebutted. The goal should be complete ostracism, absent clear and convincing evidence of non-involvement in organ transplant abuse in China with prisoner of conscience victims. This form of ostracism need not be legal. It could, in theory, be professional only and ethical, as we've heard from Wendy Rogers. Yet, realistically, the profession has had plenty of opportunities to do this already. This issue is not a new issue and has fallen well short. The failure of the profession to organize its own ostracism means that laws need to fill the gap. Right now, for the health sector in China, complicity in organ transplant abuse with prisoner of conscience victims is cost-free. Huge money is being made with no adverse consequences. Ostracism would impose a cost which would cause a reweighing of the benefits of that abuse. Third, and this is the last suggestion I'll make given the short time I have, all states need laws to enforce reporting of transplant tourism by the health sector to the public sector. Right now, we are caught in a vicious circle. We do not know enough about the transplant tourism into China. We do not do enough about transplant tourism into China because we do not know how big the problem is. And we do not know how big the problem is because we do not do enough about it. The only way out of that circle is mandatory reporting. Once we see the numbers going to China for transplants, and they are significant, we will see the extent of the problem. Awareness of the scope of the problem will mobilize actors both in China and abroad to do something about it. Do we need the law to end forced organ harvesting in China with prisoner of conscience victims? My answer is yes, we do, but they have to be the right sort of laws in the right places to have an impact on what is going on in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matus. Next, Ms. Christina Olney will provide a perspective on U.S. legislative responses. Ms. Olney of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is the Director of the Government Relations for VOC and leads the VOC's engagement with U.S. federal and state policymakers, embassies, and advocacy initiative with human rights allies and captive nations constituencies. Please welcome Ms. Olney.
Thank you, and good evening from Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank our very distinguished experts for their important remarks, and to all of you here with us today for this conference on the Chinese Communist Party's forced organ harvesting. You have just heard the evidence loud and clear from the world's leading experts on this issue. The CCP is targeting prisoners of conscience and religious minorities, particularly Falun Gong practitioners, to harvest their organs for sale in a lucrative global market worth $1 billion. This recent report by my colleague Matthew Robertson, which you can download on the website of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, lays out the evidence that Uyghur Muslims have also been victims of forced organ harvesting, as you have also just heard from my colleague Ethan Gutman in his remarks. From the government-leaked documents exposed by my colleague Dr. Adrian Zenz, we have seen what Beijing is willing to do to control Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in China, incarcerating them in concentration camps, forcibly sterilizing them, and forcing them into modern-day slavery. In November, the United States determined that these crimes constitute genocide, and yesterday, the Canadian House of Commons followed suit. On the issue of forced organ harvesting, the international community has remained silent despite the evidence for far too long. The first US congressional hearing was held on this issue in 1996, and a number of extensive reports, which you've heard about from my co-panelists, have been published on this issue in the last 2 decades. The United States and the rights-respecting nations of the world must confront the evidence of this horrific human rights abuse taking place in China today and hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for its complicity. This crime has no place in the 21st century. In terms of the policy responses to this evidence, I will speak specifically about policy responses here in the United States, and you will shortly hear from the parliamentarians joining us today from Canada, the EU, and Australia about international policy responses. There have been a number of congressional hearings and resolutions condemning forced organ harvesting, but until now, there has been no comprehensive legislation signed into law requiring the US government to address this issue. But in December of last year, Senator Cotton and Representatives Chris Smith and Tom Suozzi introduced the bicameral, bipartisan Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. If enacted, this legislation will do the following 4 significant things. Firstly, authorize the US government to sanction officials responsible for human organ trafficking or organ harvesting. Second, mandate an annual report by the State Department on human organ trafficking in foreign countries with a tiered ranking system for determining the countries that have the lowest to highest levels of forced organ harvesting or human organ trafficking, and the countries in the governments where governments are directly or indirectly supporting organ harvesting or trafficking would be subjected to sanctions. Third, require an annual report on US institutions that train organ transplant surgeons affiliated with entities in Tier 3 countries responsible for human organ trafficking. And fourth, prohibit the export of transplant surgery devices to entities responsible for forced organ harvesting. In summary, this bill will shine a light on the crime of organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting globally, and thereby shine a light on the egregious record of the Chinese Communist Party in its state-sponsored forced organ harvesting. It will establish a mechanism to effectively identify and punish the organ harvesters and traffickers who prey on vulnerable populations, including prisoners of conscience and members of ethnic minority and religious groups in China. The STOP Act is one of the most comprehensive legislative initiatives ever introduced on the issue of organ trafficking and one of the most significant international responses to the China Tribunal's judgment to date. The bill will be reintroduced next week by bipartisan leaders in both the Senate and House. We urge the US Congress to swiftly enact this bill and for international governments to pass similar legislation. For those of you asking what you can do to help end the horrific crime of forced organ harvesting, if you are here in the United States, urge your member of Congress to co-sponsor this legislation. And for those of you joining us from the 24 other nations around the world, urge your governments to pass similar legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. We have waded through the ethics of forced organ harvesting, heard testimonials of forced organ harvesting against the people of Xinjiang and the practitioners of Falun Gong, gained understanding for the needs for responses, and given a perspective of a legislative response. Next, we welcome remarks from officials from different countries. We are especially excited to hear the good news from Canada. We respectfully ask that all of the officials unmute your mic and kindly make your remarks when introduced. Your biography will be on the screen when you make your remarks. We will please continue to have your videos actively on. Our first remark is from the Honorable Mary Lou McFadden of Canada.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
This opportunity is very much appreciated. I do want to begin by recognizing that the Parliament of Canada is situated on the unsurrendered lands of First Nations in our country. I want to thank the co-hosts, Sir Geoffrey Nice, and my colleagues from Canada, David Matus and David Kilgore, sometimes known as our Davids, as well as my sister Senator Salma Otalajan, who time after time has introduced to the Senate a bill that would create 2 new offenses. It is now known as S-204, and she has introduced it. It is active in the Senate of Canada again. This bill would amend the Criminal Code of Canada, and it would also amend our Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And the new offense created in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act would be to make it very clear that any evidence of trafficking in human organs or humans would be an automatic refusal for any entry to Canada. I know that our time is very limited, so let me just go to the question of evidence and the question of political will. First and foremost, we have ample evidence. Speakers before me have given us more than enough of a summary of the evidence. I want to just highlight, because they were turning points for me in understanding the atrocities of this latest genocide, and that is the evidence in the trial in Kosovo in 2013, where we saw such detailed documentation of the industry and the devastation, mutilation, and murdering of victims of organ trafficking. And then 8 years later, just 3 weeks ago, we saw the BBC expelled from China for their very comprehensive report, including what is so far, I think, the best documented first voice, direct witness evidence on the sexualized gender-based violence that is being perpetrated following the practice of genocides that we know of that have happened shamefully many times in our world. And then just yesterday, by Canadian time, February 23rd, we had members of Parliament, elected members of Parliament, crossing all of the political barriers in our House of Commons, stand together with a unanimous vote of 266 of our MPs who declared what is happening in China, directed at Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, and I would include in this the Falun Gong, that it is indeed a genocide and meets all of the criteria defined as genocide. We hope by joining the United States parliamentarians in declaring this, that we know this is a non-binding motion of our Parliament, but it is a clear and strong and principled voice that we hope that our governments will be able to heed. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and may strength and health and safety be with you all as we continue and refuse to end this struggle.
Thank you, Senator. Next is Mr. Samir Saburi, Member of Parliament of Canada.
I'd like to thank all the organizers for bringing together this event, and for everybody who's spoken so far and shared your knowledge with us, and for all those who are tuning in and listening to this. Every single person who is paying attention to this issue, I want to thank you for doing so and for sharing information around what is happening with two minorities within China. As was said earlier, this is not about the Chinese people. This is about state policies that we need to address, that we need to confront as an international community, as a human society. I'd like to, the senator who went just before me outlined that a number of points that our parliament in Canada, the House of Commons, did recognize that a genocide is in fact occurring towards the Uyghur people and other Turkic minorities. This genocide is something that we have recognized in Canada. We are the first legislature internationally to do so. We follow the American administration, that the administration's recognition of the genocide. That, I think, is an extremely important point. I know and hope that other countries will follow suit. It's something that we must do as an international global community in order to stop these very serious crimes against humanity. So myself, I'm from the governing party. And as was mentioned, this was not a partisan issue. Everybody in the House of Commons put partisanship on the back burner, but each and every party had a majority of its members vote for the recognition of genocide that's happening within Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, also called locally as East Turkestan. Now, I was a member of a parliamentary subcommittee that heard firsthand testimony of survivors of the concentration camps, of experts like many on this panel, and we heard from survivors. One of the survivors actually spoke about a physical exam that he was subject to. It was such a detailed physical exam that when they were examining him, looking at his body, when they went to his eyes, they actually thought that he thought that they were going to pull out his eyeballs right there and then, as that exam was happening. This Uyghur individual. This individual had committed no crime, was apprehended without any charge, didn't know why he was there, but this was the exam that he was subject to. He thought that he would be dissected on the table. That's a reality we're dealing with. Canadian media has also reported that students in Canada who are not Canadian, but of Uyghur and other minority origins, have been called to the embassies and consulates to give blood samples. Why? It's a good question. But we know that blood samples, when they're given, allow they pave the way. They allow for organs to be harvested more easily. So this is real. And, you know, when I was speaking with somebody from the Uyghur advocacy groups here, he said that, you know, this what's happening to the Uyghur people and other Turkic minorities is so multifaceted that it can be hit from many different angles. We hear about the forced labor, the slave labor. We hear about the concentration camps, about the sterilization, forced abortions. The organ harvesting is actually one of the secondary issues almost compared to the others that I just enumerated. It is beyond the pale of imagination. I want to close with the idea that it is critical that we, those of us who are listening, share this information that we're hearing today on social media with our colleagues. Speak out. I'd like also those who are involved in legislatures in other parts of the world to follow suit of the United States and of Canada and actually have a clear declaration where the evidence is considered and the question is asked, is genocide in fact occurring? I do believe that we will be on the right side of history, and we need to stop this now because it is unfolding and it is happening. I'll close with that. I want to thank everybody for their courage for standing up. Sir Geoffrey Nice Jeffrey Nice for being with us. And I'm looking forward to the tribunal which you are heading up and the results of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bearing good news, and all of humanity cheers for Canada's courage and love for humanity. Next is Mr. Ivan Gilibor Sinčić, Member of Parliament of the EU from Croatia.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me all?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Good evening from Brussels. What I want to point out here is that there is a huge gap between human rights and what we see in China today in the 21st century. China has shown systematic persecution against ethnic, political, and religious minorities, as we all know. Only recent events in Hong Kong witness of political oppression. Many Uyghurs, as mentioned, are in concentration camps, suffering persecution and medical experiments. Many people don't know that. We need to raise the consciousness among our citizens and all around the world. Besides forced labor, imprisonment, concentration camps, and torture, the worst by far is forced organ harvesting, sometimes even done in vivo while the person is still alive and aware. Also, as you mentioned, the group that is a common victim of forced organ harvesting are Falun Gong practitioners, because they are often very healthy people, both physically and mentally. Unfortunately, this practice is lasting for decades with a lot of denial from Communist Party of China. 2/3 of all transplant tourists go to China to have an organ replacement, while a patient, for example, in Europe, in Croatia, has to spend years on a waiting list for a transplantation. It is only weeks and sometimes even days in China. Of course, it is impossible that the Communist Party of China does not know or that it is not aware of this issue. They are very, very much involved. They are lying. Forced organ harvesting is a tool to remove political opponents for them. It is a tool to make money. It's a tool to support the health system of China. When I first heard about forced organ harvesting many years ago, I was outraged as a human, and I was sad because little to nothing was being done to stop this at high-level politics. Today, in 2021, I am happy to see that forced organ harvesting in China is being taken more and more serious with every passing day, that more and more people know what is happening, that there are more and more conferences, and that the awareness is rising rapidly. The world must stand united in condemnation of this practice. Myself, as a member of the European Parliament, I must say that for far too long has European Union been afraid of criticizing China too much. This is because of economic benefits and huge trade deals with China. But this must end. People's lives must be put first. It's time to stop fearing the Chinese economic power. Europe must take a strong position, and of course the world must take a strong position on this issue. What is important to mention is that there are non-Chinese companies from here, from Europe, from America, from Asia, that benefit from forced organ harvesting and organ trading. Unfortunately, many global brands are also tied to forced labor in China. These companies need to be investigated and sanctions must be put upon them and their personnel. It is indeed time for the world to show strength and condemn forced organ harvesting in China, and of course in any other country that has cases of this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your remarks. Next, we have the Honourable Senator Eric Abetz from Australia.
It's a great honour to be with you all, and can I thank all those that have already made remarks. When it comes to evils in the world today, few can match the forced and systematic harvesting of organs from prisoners of conscience by the communist dictatorship in China in either scale or depravity. When Falun Gong practitioners, house Christians, Uyghur Muslims or Tibetan Buddhists, victims have their organs forcibly removed and fed into a vast underground trade. The communist regime makes every effort to deny and conceal the practice, yet the mounting evidence necessitates the need for the world to speak out against this barbaric practice with ever greater vigour. The Ccp'S program of forced organ harvesting is unfortunately only one of the many human rights abuses committed, along with the genocide carried out against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the social credit system, the imprisonment of political dissenters, not to mention the violation of the UN-sanctioned Sino-British Joint Declaration in Hong Kong and the crushing of Hong Kong's freedoms. Such contempt for human rights is an ugly reality for China's people and an affront to the ideals of humanity. I would like to thank Sir Geoffrey for his instrumental work as chair of the China Tribunal and the members of the Tribunal for their work in bringing greater global awareness to this truly horrid practice of forced organ harvesting. Though my home country of Australia finds itself under pressure from China to relent to its economic coercion and stay silent on its human rights abuses, we will do no such thing. All the economic benefits in the world cannot sway our advocacy for the victims of forced organ harvesting. The short-sighted expediency of appeasement has been demonstrated far too often to allow us to repeat such morally bankrupt folly. Victims of organ harvesting need us to be their strong voice now more than ever, and posterity will rightly judge those who chose the easy road of silence. It's heartening that representatives from so many nations have joined today. We know we can only effect change with greater awareness and a strong, united voice. That's why this conference is so important. The oppressed deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we have the Honourable David Kilgore of Canada.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I want to thank everybody who's participated here from so many corners of the world, all the people who've spoken. We only have a very short time, so I'm afraid I'll have to get right to first of all, I should refer to the wonderful vote we had that's been referred to by two colleagues from Canada. And I must tell you that a Uyghur friend of mine, a Canadian friend, when she heard of the vote, she burst out into tears. She was so moved by it. There was an additional part to the motion you might be interested in that would call on Canada's government to push for a relocation of the 2022 Winter Olympics out of Beijing. Some of you will recall that in 2008, when this issue had come alive, we also pushed hard, and the government of China said they would improve human rights, but we all know that has not happened. So I hope some of you will help on the Olympics issue as well. And please persuade your own legislators to do the same that Canada has done as quickly as possible. It's been a huge boost in Canada, and I'm sure it would be a boost in all of your countries as well. Mass slaughter of a community is the most common feature of genocide, such as Rwanda, but murdering members of specified groups for their organs would surely qualify too. China is unique among 200 independent countries today in that its organ transplant commerce system is state-run rather than a criminal offense done by unscrupulous surgeons. Dr. Henry Toti, and I wish he was here today too. A Uyghur has detailed how in 1995, as a general surgeon in the Urumqi hospital in Xinjiang, he was sent to an execution ground to remove the kidneys and liver from a still alive prisoner. The news items recently on the BBC World Service and the CNN appear to have had a major effect on public opinion about the Beijing regime in both the UK, US, and well beyond. Uyghur women in those broadcasts described the rape and torture that other Uyghur victims had experienced in concentration camps. I'm trying to keep this short. Ethan has already spoken as brilliantly as always. In 2017, Xi Jinping began erecting re-education gulag for Muslim communities, similar to those established for Falun Gong after mid-99 across China. Both networks receive inmates arrested by police, as I'm sure you all know, without any pretense of a hearing, trial, or appeal, a grim practice invented in Stalin's Soviet Union. Dr. Maya Matilapova of MIT has said, and I quote, "The entire population of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims in Xinjiang has been forcefully health checked and blood samples have been withdrawn from 2016 on. Those procedures were only done on the Muslim population." So before my time is gone, repeat some of the calls to actions we've already heard. All our governments should join the half dozen or so countries that ban travel to China for transplant surgery. Any deal with China on any matter must include an insistence that this barbaric practice stop immediately, coupled with a mechanism whereby such stoppage is verifiable. Responsible governments and businesses worldwide, including Canada, and I hope all of your countries, should join the US and Australia in boycotting anyone doing business in Xinjiang. Forced labor in its internment camps is poisoning the supply chain of numerous well-known companies from democratic nations. There's been reference already to the US House of Representatives and this new bill, bipartisan bicameral bill. I won't speak to that. All of us with Magnitsky laws, as David Matus said, should apply targeted sanctions against any Chinese government official known to be involved in organ harvesting. If we and other democracies show more commitment to our values, and I might say to our backbones, the despicable commerce might soon end. Canada, like Australia, should perhaps adopt a foreign interference law to stop Chinese officials from interfering with Canadians anywhere in our nation. All United Front organizations posing as community groups should be registered as foreign agents in Canada and hopefully elsewhere. I think that's where I have to stop. And it's an honor to be with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your work, and we look forward to your continued leadership. And thank you to all the dignitaries that have made your comments. We want to recognize other dignitaries that are in attendance today. That includes Duten Wangchen, member of Tibetan Parliament in Exile, Ms. Anne Oscarsson, member of the Riksdag, Sweden, Mr. Michael Cooper, member of Parliament, Canada, Ingrid Leary, Member Parliament, New Zealand, Ramesh Sangha, Member of Parliament, Canada, Jin Yul Park, First Secretary, United Nations Permanent Mission of Republic of Korea, Ms. Lucy Ashford, Senior Policy Officer, New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Ms. Munda Matiha, European Commission, Ms. Kathy Unlu, Senior Congress Affairs Advisor of Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, U.S. State Department, Jennifer Glodmans, Senior Advisor of Office of Global Criminal Justice, United States State Department, Carla Burry, Senator Multilateral Affairs Advisor at Office of Monitor and Combating Trafficking in Persons, U.S. State Department, Michael Kokonciliani, U.S. State Department, Kim Roy, U.S. State Department, Tina Mumford, U.S. State Department, and Emise Helgi, Policy Advisor European Parliament. Thank you so much for being here with us. Due to the full program, the organizer has delayed the question and answer session to after the conference. We respectfully invite you to stay for the informal question and answer session following the conference. We will now welcome Dr. Tran for the closing remark.
Instead of a closing remark, I'll just read the quotes from the China Tribunal. Past practices of the kind alleged, if proved, are not to be set aside as historic and more conveniently forgotten. These allegations are of the gravest possible kind that should attract the maximum public censures, if proved whether or not continuing. Any who interact in any substantial way with the PRC should now recognize that they are, to the extent revealed above, interacting with a criminal state. And if China is a criminal state, then the CCP must be a criminal organization. And we know that dealing with criminals, the only way to stop them is to punish. On that note, I would like to stop and let we begin our question and answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we end today's conference on the CCP's forced organ harvesting, we would like to thank you for joining the conference. In particular, we'd like to express our sincere gratitude to Sir Jeffrey, the panelists for sharing their expertise, and the elected representative for their commitment to eradicate these atrocities. We want to especially thank our co-host ETAC and Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for their respected leadership in this arena. We ask that you support them and other NGOs who advocate for the Falun Gong, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Uyghurs. We meet today not only to discuss the implications and ethics of the atrocity, but more importantly, the steps necessary to criminalize and make accountable. Despite the difficulties, there is a lot that can be done to change the situation through transparency, dialogues, and participation. These are the things that totalitarian regimes don't have. Today's victims are the people of Xinjiang and practitioners of Falun Gong. Tomorrow, it may be the Cantonese of Hong Kong. No one is safe. Stop stealing our medical records. Our children, grandchildren, friends, and neighbors could go missing from an enticed abroad mission or vacation. Anyone can be lured, drugged, kidnapped, or volunteered for forced organ harvesting. Treatments of the Uyghurs by the CCP has been deemed a genocide by nations. The CCP should be designated as a transnational criminal organization. Free people have freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of religion. Multilateral societies have universal suffrage, with it the right to run for office and the right to nominate candidates, ensuring free and fair elections. Multilateral rules of law, multilateral policies, and political systems start at home. A totalitarian regime demands, entices multilateralism without check and balance. Without check and balance is without good faith and a poison pill for genuine trust and agreements. Human rights is an invaluable tool and enforceable for the love and respect of our humanity. We hope that you will continue to advance freedom and liberty and independence in your part of the world. The conference ends here. The 117 organizations again thank all that made this conference possible. The organizer will have the extended informal forum for another 30 minutes. We invite you to stay for the discussion. Please continue to have your videos on. So the first question is for Sean Lin. I hope he's still here. What is the percentage of domestic consumption versus international? How many transplant clinics are in China?
That's a huge question. As China's transplant center grew exponentially after 1999, after the persecution of Falun Gong started. And at the beginning, it was military hospital involved, and then later on, the civilian hospital involved as well. So you can see even within single transplant center, the bedding numbers also increased tremendously. Just like in Tianjin, #1 transplant centers, at the beginning it's only a few hundreds of beds for transplant, and in a few years it reached to 2,000 beds. You know, so it has tremendous growth, and now nationwide it's huge volumes of not only military hospitals, civilian hospitals, all involved in organ transplant. In the past, Chinese Communist Party restricted to only class 3 category A hospital, one of the best hospitals that are qualified to do this organ transplant. And then later on, they loosened up the restriction, and now more and more second-class hospitals are also involved in organ transplant as well. So it has a tremendous incentives for many of the hospitals to do this organ transplant. Some of those not only getting the organs from government sources, they're also using you can say mafias, or those gangster society to kidnap people to get the organ as well. So once the government sanction these kind of large-scale organ harvesting, and then the society have so many sectors realize this is a very lucrative business. So many of the dark sector of the society all joining this big business.
Thank you. The next question is for Ethan Gutman. There are many different statements on the number of organ transplant centers operating in China. One report indicated 300, another indicates around 1,000 transplant centers actively. Can you comment on this variance? Oh, you're still mute, Ethan.
Very good. Okay, there we go. The figures back in 2016, there's been some confusion. In the early days, back in, going back to sort of 2005 and so forth, we were seeing an exponential growth, and you did come up to numbers like 1,000 hospitals, which were all doing, which appeared to all have some sort of transplant facilities, or were doing it. Along the way, as part of the supposed reform that was taking place, the Beijing basically gave an order to kind of rationalize the system, and that brought it down to a much lower number. Which initially, when we were looking at it in 2015, 2016 in detail, was about 165 hospitals. Okay, and that was supposed to show this progress, that they were. China was on the mend, it was all being controlled and so forth. This included military hospitals as well. The evidence is that then they started expanding it again, and they basically have approximately doubled the numbers now in 2021 from the time we were looking at this in close detail. Do I believe that 1,000 hospitals are certainly capable of this? Of course, yeah, absolutely. Are some of those hospitals involved in it? Yes, no question. Are they major contributors? No. I think the Chinese probably did rationalize this to several major centers. That's what we picked up. That's what our 2016 report shows, is that you had several just enormous hospitals, which we're doing right doing 2,000 transplants per year, 3,000, 4,000, and the queen and the biggest gem in the crown was Shenzhen Central Hospital, which was doing well over 5,000 transplants per year, by far the biggest transplant hospital in the entire world. So I don't think one should get too carried away with the numbers of hospitals. It doesn't matter. We know the facilities are all over the country. Every province has several competing hospitals which claim to do more kidney transplants or more liver transplants than anybody else in that province. And so I think that's a bad thing. I think another thing is the Chinese like to use this, or Beijing likes to use this as a way of kind of obfuscating the whole thing. For example, when they say, well, there's other hospitals out there which are mafia controlled, that's an argument they dance out once a year to sort of say, hey, if there's any abuses out there, they're being done by some rogue doctors. And I don't buy it. Okay, this is state controlled. Every one of these hospitals has incredibly intricate surveillance, and that surveillance goes all the way to the top. The Central Committee can see anything it wants, not just the military hospitals, the civilian hospitals as well. And so I think we always have to keep that in mind. There's not a lot going on in China that is not being recorded at this stage. And I hope that sort of answers the specific answer. If we had Matthew Robertson here, he's sort of the big bean counter on hospitals right now, and I think he'd be able to give a much more explicit answer.
Thank you. The next question is an open question from a physician, I believe. What can physicians do to help? Wendy, do you would like to, Dr. Rogers, would you like to begin?
Yeah, look, thanks for the question. I think there's quite a lot that physicians can do because they are generally respected members of public, and it's easier for them to get the ears of government. When they ring their MP for an appointment, they're more likely to get one than someone that's not a member of a highly esteemed professional group. So I think for people who are actually involved in transplant and ancillary activities, they can do the kinds of undertake the kinds of actions I outlined, particularly getting their professional organisations to organise and to really create a China policy and enforce it. We've seen that the Transplant Society has had a China policy, but it hasn't enforced its own policy with any great effect, and I think that's been much to the detriment of drawing attention to and putting pressure on Chinese professionals. In terms of physicians who are not actually involved in transplantation, there are still things they can do. They can still engage in lobbying. They can join the various organizations, End Transplant Abuse in China, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. Both of those organizations have a number of actions that they recommend for individuals to take. And as I've suggested, those actions tend to be more powerful if they're undertaken by physicians. Talking to patients, putting up information in waiting rooms, even talking to their family and friends as well, because when information comes from a healthcare practitioner, it's often given more credibility than if it's just read on the internet. So those are some of the actions I'd advocate for.
Right.
I could add something if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Yes, well, I think in terms of legislation, because I've been active in different countries to try to get legislation, the legislatures tend to look to the medical profession, since we're dealing with medical matters, and so it's different. It has a different weight or impetus if the medical profession asks for the legislation or even approves the legislation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the transplantation component. It could be other components. Typically, the way the medical profession is organized in different countries, it has an umbrella component and it has specialized components. And very often, the umbrella component, which includes all the professionals, medical professionals, is considered a politically more important voice than just a specialist component. So I would say to any doctor who wants to get involved, by all means, everything, I agree with everything Wendy Rogers says, but I would also say, try to get your component, whatever it is, of the medical profession engaged in asking the government to propose legislation in this area. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to add.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions, and the next question is to you, Dr. Matus. Do you believe that the Uyghurs concentration camps in China are morally no different than the Nazi camps in the Soviet camps?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you know, each form of abuse has its own particularities, and there are differences between what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust and what's happening to the Uyghurs, in the sense that what was going on with the Holocaust was intentional, complete, systematic mass killing. There was no such thing as joining the Nazi Party or becoming German. It was an attempt to kill absolutely everybody, and that isn't quite what's going on in Xinjiang. I mean, it is a genocide, but it's a genocide of a different character. It's much more similar to what happened to the Falun Gong in the sense that well, it's the same type of detention camps, the same forced labor, the same organ harvesting. The difference with the Falun Gong is, well, first of all, it's geographically concentrated, and secondly, there's this attempt at cultural assimilation, which, I mean, the Falun Gong were already Han Chinese, so that wasn't an issue. It certainly bears a resemblance to what was going on with the Soviet camps. The Soviets, in a sense, they manufactured. It was kind of a paranoid thing. They manufactured people who weren't really enemies in order to justify their own hold on power. And there is certainly that going on, both with Falun Gong and the Uyghurs. That the Uyghurs are blanketly called terrorists, and that's the justification for it. But this is really the justification is you know, manufacture an enemy so that the communists have kind of a propaganda justification for staying in power, and I would say it is similar to the Soviets and the camps in that sense. Yes.
Just go ahead, Ethan. Okay, you're still mute. David Kilgore, are you on? You can say it, and then you can try to unmute yourself, Ethan. Okay, both of you need to unmute yourself. There you go. I think I can hear.
Okay, no, this is the organizer keeps muting me. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm not making any embarrassing noise. I'm not doing it wrong here. Now I've kind of lost the point here, but go ahead, David, please.
Well,
David, go ahead.
Ethan is doing marvelous work on what's happening to the Uyghurs, and please, you go first, Ethan. You're doing this almost full time.
Well, I do think there is one other aspect that I put in that is a little different than either Soviets or Nazi point. Xinjiang is really a very financially, there's a gold mine in Xinjiang. It's energy. The Chinese do control the water coming off the Tibetan plateau. They are rerouting it. They are talking about making the desert bloom. Okay, they are talking about moving in Han Chinese. So I think it's a little closer to the Lebensraum idea. Move in vast amounts of Han Chinese. You have to get rid of these people. And then finally, there's the Belt and Road Initiative, which this is the jumping off point for Xi Jinping's project. This is the launch point. So I think if you put those together, you also have an economic incentive, which is very strong in this case. And there's a sense that they just simply want to depopulate this region of, you know, this is something a little more like the Trail of Tears or something in America, or at least there's an aspect of that.
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that some of you may not realize that the nuclear 47, I think it was nuclear.
Are you breaking up on us? Do you have a good connection?
I think he's going to talk about that this has been an experimental area for nuclear weapons back in the 60s. That Xinjiang has always been used that way by the Chinese as an area to exploit. If I'm guessing, he is a translator here. David, you're not coming.
You have really bad connection to the internet. So let me move forward. We have three threads of questions to Sir Jeffrey. They're kind of similar to each other, so I'll try to paraphrase. So you can try to unmute yourself while I'm getting these questions together for you. They're from three different people: Mark Fernandez, Lily Williams, and Guang Nguyen. It's more or less like, what organization can prosecute the CCP for its crime, and what happened to the petition that was asked on from the United Nations to investigate on the organ harvesting, and did it get silenced? And the third is, what kind of platform can we collectively raise to discuss more about the organ harvesting?
Yeah, maybe I could say something about the petition, because I actually carted it into the UN on a trolley one time and met with the officials about it. And basically they said to us, go to the UN office. We took this into the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, their officials said, basically, you should take this up with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, because the UN Office of Drugs and Crime has deals with the Convention on Transnational Crime and a Protocol on Human Trafficking. And so we went to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and asked them to deal with this. And they said, well, human trafficking does have a component which is organ trafficking, but if you're trafficking a human for their organs, but it doesn't deal with transplant tourism. So what the part that you're concerned with is not within the ambit of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. So basically, and this was in Vienna, it was in a different city. So it just went nowhere, and the UN did nothing about it. And that's what happened.
That's a shame. So Jeffrey Nice, would you like to take the other two threads?
Yeah, I didn't hear the last bit, but I can at least pick up very briefly on the first two. The short answer is that getting the People's Republic of China or one or two other countries, Russia, America, to international courts is pretty well difficult to the point of impossible. And it's impossible because either they have a reservation on such treaties they may have agreed to, which would subject them to jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, or they haven't ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, or they can exercise a veto in the Security Council, which would make any attempt to have the matter referred to the International Criminal Court difficult to the point of impossibility. Now, that's just the structure of the so-called international legal system, which is a partial system, and people have to understand that. There is no operating universal system. And the reason there isn't one is because big countries don't want one. You really have to be completely blunt about this. It's a really shocking truth, which has got lost in the 70 years since the Genocide Convention was drafted, that countries such as America, England, or rather Great Britain, or Little Britain, England, Great Britain, Russia, they all didn't want the Genocide Convention. Just 4 or 5 years after visiting the camps, they didn't want it. They didn't sign it. They didn't ratify it. They were dragged to do it 20 years later. And now, if you come to our silly little country in England, you'll find that there's every effort on the part of the government to stop even the slightest recognition of genocide, which is being proposed as some measure to stop trade if people are going to trade with a genocidal country. That's the real world, and there are very limited judicial legal systems for getting at big countries. Some are being tried, some are innovative, some may have some success. But ultimately, the great thing that's happening now, as a result of the great publicity given to the Uyghurs, whether the factual underlying assertions are correct or not, I can't say anything about that because I'm chairing the tribunal. But the great fact is it's created a real public will which just might drive countries such as Canada, first of all, to do something in Parliament with bravery, and who knows, to take other steps that may operate outside the law through sanctions, through Magnitsky Act processes and so on. It's not people doing it, but I'm sorry, the criminal law's a bit of a dead letter.
Yeah, sorry to hear about that. Maybe that might change. But this next question is directed to MP Zuberi and other parliament members that are still here. What do you think of the Biden's administration recent comments on China's treatment of Uyghurs?
So those comments would have to be paraphrased to me because I actually have been so focused on the Canadian vote that I haven't had a chance to look at them. So if you can briefly paraphrase them, please.
Mr. Sinchik, well, you want to take that question? Does anybody want to comment on what Biden administration?
Yeah, I could say something about that. The current issue of The Economist magazine discusses this issue very methodically and only the way The Economist can do. But the essence of it is that the last day in office, Mr. Pompeo declared that it was a genocide occurring in Xinjiang. And the new Secretary of State has supported him on that, in effect. And the question is, where do we go from here? Does the Biden administration tell companies they can't make things in Xinjiang? And all these kinds of things have yet to be answered. As of now, both the Biden and the Trump administrations have supported calling this a genocide under the Genocide Convention, with all of the problems that Jeffrey has mentioned and others have mentioned here today. That's really where it sits for now. And time will tell where we'll go, what we can do to get companies to stop using their supply chains in Xinjiang to make all kinds of products, for example, Volkswagen.
So in the same vein, the next question is saying, why do Western media play down or ignore the atrocity in China, and if so, why?
I'll take this one. I mean, others should be contributing. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer or a myth that Western media isn't focusing on what's happening. Because if you look at the premier Canadian paper, the Globe and Mail, you'll see that there is coverage on this issue every other day, and it's been consistent for several months. So it is there. We know the BBC's coverage has been there. The New York Times is covering, The Guardian. So the publications are covering it. I think that we just need to pay a bit more attention to what is happening. And we need to ourselves, all of us are informed on this call. And we need to share this information with others and get it out there. Social media is a very powerful tool. We know that. It's utilized in developing world to protect human rights. Let's utilize it here to inform our fellow citizens.
Ethan, it looks like you want to comment. You still have a mute problem. So Jeffrey, you need to unmute yourself as well, Sir Jeffrey.
Just quickly, I was just answering the same question on Facebook. Somebody sent me the same question, so it's kind of a mute. But I have the same response. I don't believe the media has actually been that bad. They do cover this sporadically. They cover it, but when they go in, they cover it quite extensively at times. And the New York Times is a great example of that. They've run about 7 major articles that have really added to our knowledge of organ harvesting in China. I would say that the problem here doesn't even lie in the political sphere. I would say the problem lies in the medical establishment, the Western medical establishment. This is they are the ones who come in. We come in with new findings, and the World Health Organization directly contradicts them using Chinese talking points, or the WMA decides to just absolutely go out of their way to ignore whatever's just come up. We're not having a discussion within the medical community to a great extent. I mean, there's obviously Australia. There's been a lot of progress in that area, but I wouldn't say that's how it really happened here in the UK, and I wouldn't say that's really happened in the USA. And I don't know about Canada on that, but I think there's been a disconnect within the medical establishment, and that is the problem, not the media. And the work is out there, and wouldn't have there's many ways to look at that work, okay, including just a Google search, a simple Google search.
All right. So Jeffrey, did you want to add?
Yeah, who am I to know about the press? But in 2019, on the 17th of June, when we read out our judgment in short form, there was a large program prepared by Newsnight, British Broadcasting Corporation's principal political program, probably a 10-15-minute program with filmed interviews with people like Ethan and victims and all sorts of people. And guess what happened in the afternoon? Just before the program was going to go out, guess who walked into the office of the editor of Newsnight and said, please don't publish this? The British government. At that time, the Foreign Office, walked in, whether it was on the phone or in person, I don't know. Now, that was before the atmosphere had changed about China. So this was still the time when Great Britain loved China for trade. But the press is, amongst other things, subject to government influence, even in the United Kingdom. The program did not go out. Whether it was the Foreign Secretary's intervention or some internal BBC problem or both, I don't know. But I was pretty disappointed in my own country on that day.
This next question goes to Christina only. I hope that you're still here. According to the Black Book of Communism, China has killed 65 million of its own people for political and Marxism reasons since 1950. And crimes continue to this day. Why are these crimes not addressed by the world leaders, and what could they do? I guess this is not really, I don't believe this question is very relevant at this time, maybe at another conference. We'll go to the next question. Now, do any of you have questions for each other? Go ahead. You need to unmute yourself, David Kilgore.
Okay, Ethan, can you hear me?
He can hear you, so can I.
Okay, Ethan, will you please tell us a little bit more about what you've done in terms of the airports in Urumqi and what you're finding that might be useful to Sir Geoffrey in his inquiry, along with the rest of us, about the organ pillaging in a large scale for Uyghurs and other Muslims in the region?
Ethan still muted.
Oh, Ethan, why
I'm
don't
so
you
sorry.
just why don't you just take yourself off?
Because they keep muting me, then the organizer mutes me if I don't mute myself.
Okay, don't mute anybody.
So no, I was going to say this has been close to a citizen investigation in the sense the people noticing these green lanes, and that's how it's come up. You know, a couple of the ones that you find on the internet are actually taken by Japanese tourists who just simply would snap these pictures of these funny lanes, these green lanes. And what's interesting about these green lanes is that most of the time, with the exception of some that are in Shanghai and apparently in Guangzhou, they are in places where the population is very, very small. Okay, Xinjiang population compared to density, the density of population in Kashgar, for example, is tiny compared to most Chinese areas, residency. And so what you have, and the arrows are just pointing out. In other words, they're not bringing organs in; they're going one way. So I think that's pretty interesting that they've done that, and that even after this was picked up by the press and the academic world, also started going around this images on Twitter. The Chinese didn't get rid of them, and I believe that's one of the soft spots, the soft underbellies of China in this, is that there's money to be made. They will continue to keep those things going for a while, and we can pick up some research for a while. I'm sure they'll get rid of the green lanes by the end of the year. I promise you. I'll bet money on it. But right now they're still there, and the green lanes actually started because of one doctor who's a real barbarian, Dr. Chen of Wuxi People's Hospital, and he actually was trying to get some organs. He was trying to fly them from one location to another to do the transplants, and the plane was late. We all know how frustrating it is when a plane's late, and he threw an absolute fit. And China Southern Airlines, it was a China Southern Airlines plane, and then China Southern Airlines responded by creating these green lanes. And there's a wonderful picture on the web of the two of them like cutting a ribbon or something together. So you can see how powerful these doctors are, these transplant doctors. Not only are they rich, but they're powerful. They can make one of the biggest airlines in the world change heaven and earth. So I just think that's interesting. That's all I'd say about it. It's very interesting subtopic.
Thank you, Ethan.
Again, thank you. Thank you for coming to the conference. We want to especially thank our co-host, ETAC, and Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. We ask that you support them and other NGOs. Your presence today shows a strong commitment to work toward eradicating the horrendous practice of forced organ harvesting. And again, thank you for coming, and we hope we had some good news, and we will continue to have good news so that we could help our brothers and sisters. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, everybody.